Hello and welcome back to my channel. I hope you had a wonderful July, and I am so excited to share with you everything that I read in the month of July. Before we even get started, make sure to like and subscribe if you'd like to see more of my videos. I also highly recommend, if you like my content, to check it out on TikTok and Instagram. I'm EasyCat at both of those places. I post in those places a lot more frequently. Instagram, I post a couple times a week, and TikTok, I post a couple times a day, so that's really the best places to find me. I had one of those months where I felt like I wasn't reading as much this month, and yet when I actually stacked up the books that I read this month, I actually did read quite a bit, so I'm really happy about that. It was like a pleasant surprise. It was kind of a mixed bag this month. There was some stuff I loved, there was some stuff I didn't love, there was some stuff that's getting a lot of hype that a lot of people are really liking that I actually didn't love as much as I thought I would, so we'll talk about all of that, but let's jump in and look at everything that I read in July. The fact that I read this book at the beginning of July is really weird to me because it feels like I read it a million years ago. We Are Inevitable by Gayle Forman. This book is about a young man who, his name is Aaron, and he works in his family's like old bookstore, and the bookstore's like falling apart, and he compares it to a dinosaur, like it's going extinct. And so he decides, because the bookstore is actually left to him in his name, that he's going to sell the bookstore. And in the meantime, he kind of like makes all these connections and all these people who want to help him like get the bookstore back off the ground again. So he regrets that he's selling it, and you kind of see him go through all of this. It's got this really quirky YA feel to it. I actually quite liked this book. I liked it more than I thought I was going to. Early on, I felt like the quirky humor and like the quirky like banter was a little silly, but I kind of grew into it as the book went on. One thing I will say is on the cover, there's like a guy and a girl, and the female character is very minimal. In fact, I don't think the book should have had this like slightly romantic relationship at all, because really this story is about him and this friend that he makes. It's kind of about a bromance a little bit. And that part of the story was way more interesting to me, like these two characters kind of like getting to know each other. One of them is in a wheelchair, and just seeing their relationship, just this like friendship grow, that was way more interesting to me. The actual like little bit of a romantic relationship kind of felt tacked on, and honestly I could have done completely without it, because it just didn't add very much to the story for me. That being said, I thought this was, if you're looking for like a good YA story, this book is really a great book for people who love books, which I think we all do. It really talks about bookstores. It talks about a love for books. It talks about, really like kind of banding together and being able to rely on people and to trust people, because the main character has a really hard time relying on people. He always thinks everyone is out to get him. He has like severe trust issues. But I thought it was really good. It was really light. It was a super fast read. So if you're looking for like a light contemporary YA read, I would definitely check this one out. I thought it was very cute and very fun. So next up is an adult fantasy book. This is definitely one for adults. This is The Blacktongue Thief, which was by Christopher Buehlman. This is definitely like a dark fantasy story about a thief. He owes the Thieves Guild like tons of money, and he accidentally attacks this like woman who is very powerful, and she's like trying to find her queen, and so she basically like hires him, and they go on this adventure together. This was a really, 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 really dense world. I mean, there's like a game, like a gambling game that's played in the book, and I feel like when I finished this book, I felt like I could have played it because it was described in such vivid detail. This book has a lot of humor. It's very dark humor, and it's a very wild ride. Now, I will say, picking up this book, it was on the cover, it's recommended by Nicholas Eames. I know books are recommended a lot, but just reading what this was and knowing that Nicholas Eames wrote Kings of the Wild, which is one of my favorite fantasy books I've read recently, I went into it kind of expecting that, and I didn't quite get that out of it. Mainly because the world and the characters are, while they're very deep and they're very interesting, and I loved everything that was built up in this story, I didn't find it as like lovable as Kings of the Wild. Kings of the Wild, the characters and the world are just, you just love all of them so much, and it's such a fun ride. It's a laugh out loud, like fun fantasy journey, but it still like takes itself seriously enough to be a worthy like fantasy novel. This was maybe just like a little too gritty for me as well. I would say though, if you're a fan of things like The Witcher, or if you like those like a little bit darker fantasy, you should definitely check out The Blacktongue Thief. I did think it was an excellent book. I just think for me, it was maybe like a little too dark, a little too gritty. The humor was a little too dark, a little too gritty. I like something maybe like, I love high fantasy, but I like high fantasy that's maybe a little lighter. So this is more in the realm of like Game of Thrones, like that kind of dark gritty, whereas for me, like Kings of the Wild, like Wheel of Time, like stuff that's like a little lighter is a little bit better for me. But I think if you like dark fantasy and adult fantasy, you'll really enjoy this book. Next up, I read Blackout. So this is a really cool book. This was by Dhonielle, Clayton, Tiffany D. Jackson, Nick Stone, Angie Thomas, Ashley Woodfolk, and Nicola Yoon. A whole bunch of authors basically write short stories that all center around a blackout that happens in New York. Obviously, it's dealing with Black characters. And all of these stories kind of like, they don't really link up per se, but they all kind of like are brought together by the common fact of this blackout. And one thing I really liked is one of the short stories is actually split into parts. So it's like you'll read part of that short story, then you'll read like a full short story by one of the authors, then you'll read the second part of that first short story. And so it kind of like helps it feel really cohesive. Obviously, with any short story anthology like this, there are going to be ones that are better and ones that are worse. None of the short stories is bad. They're all really good. I definitely like Nick Stone's really stood out to me. Nicola Yoon's was probably my favorite in the book. Angie Thomas's was like okay for me. It's probably like if I had to rank Angie Thomas's work, it would not be my favorite Angie Thomas work, but it was fine. I really love that the book didn't shy away from dealing with different kinds of backgrounds. There are some queer stories in here. There are all kinds of different Black stories, and none of these Black stories is about trauma. I think that's really important. These are all Black love stories, and I just love that. This is a very light, fun, happy book, which I think so many Black books, and one that we're going to talk about, even though I thought it was really good, was a very traumatic read. This was a very like just full of love and hope and joy book, and I loved that. So Blackout, highly recommend. I give this 5 out of 5. I really loved it. Next up is another Black authored book. So this was Skye Falling by Mia Mckenzie. I got this from Book of the Month. This book is really solidified for me that I just adore books about characters that are like hot mess express, like characters that do not in any way, shape, or form have their life together. They are just complete disasters of human beings, like the kind of characters you don't feel like you can leave alone because they'll just like screw up their life even more if you like take your eyes off of them. That is how I felt about Skye in this book. I mean, I loved her. She was a wreck, but I loved her. So this is about a woman who, a queer woman who, she finds out that basically an egg that she donated has become a full-grown child, and this child comes and finds her and wants her to be a part of her life. And she is in no way a person who should be like a parent figure, but she kind of has, and she's also someone who like doesn't like to have any connections to people whatsoever because she doesn't handle connections well. But I just really loved this a lot. It does have a darker sense of humor, for sure, and it's got a super unique voice. But I really loved it a lot. I thought it was just so good. I thought watching this character's journey and watching her like try and figure out how to like be connected to people and, you know, have these connections and be an adult. And I really love, to kind of add on to what I said before, I really love stories about adults growing up. Does that make sense? I love stories about adults, like, because I mean, every adult that is in this age range, she's older than me. I think she's in her like 40s. But even myself, there are days where I'm like, God, when am I going to grow up? Like, when am I going to be a proper adult? And I think that's why I feel so connected to stories like this. And I just really love this book. So if you get a chance, that's Skye Falling by Mia Mckenzie. It was so good. Next one is easily my favorite book that I read this month. Hands down, no competition. And that was Ace of Spades. That was Ace of Spades by Faridah, Àbíké-Íyímídé. I'm sure I said that wrong, but I'll hold it up here so you can see, and I'll also put the title down below. So one of the hard things about talking about this book is that, you know, we're talking a lot on Book Talk right now, and I'm sure it gets talked about on YouTube, is content warnings. So I highly recommend, I'm not going to list them all here, but I highly recommend looking into content warnings before you read this book. The reason I say that is, part of the reason that it's hard to talk about content warnings with this book is there's really no way to really greatly talk about the content warnings without spoiling the book. Does that make sense? It's sort of a weird thing. So it's hard to talk about the content warnings without spoiling the book, but I feel like you do need to talk about the content warnings. So what I'm going to say, I'm going to try and do this in the least spoilery way possible, but I would describe this book, and many people before me have described this book in this way. It is Get Out meets Gossip Girl with a light sprinkling of Pretty Little Liars. So it's got kind of that like school harassment, by an unknown entity thing going on, but it also has the racial implications and the racially charged piece of Get Out. So that's the part that I would say is the content warning piece. There's some very racially charged aspects to the bullying in this book. So like I said, check out content warnings before you read it. But oh man, this book was dark. It was twisty. It's edge of your seat. It's like a dark academia thriller. I really loved the two main characters. I just found them so interesting. I was like nail biting, like, because I was so stressed for them. I love Pretty Little Liars. I loved Get Out. I don't know if I've actually like watched enough Gossip Girl to say that I loved it, but I love stuff like that. And just the combination of all of it is just so flawlessly executed in this book. It's a terrifying book. It's like a book that you don't want to put down, but you do want to put down because it's stressing you out. But it's so good. Please check content warnings before you read it, but I highly, highly, highly recommend Ace of Spades. The next book up is weird. It's hard to talk about. I still haven't got my head around it. So this is D, A Tale of Two Worlds by Michael Faber. Okay, so this is about a girl, like a young girl. It's like a very like, kind of like fantasy-esque story about this girl who's just like living her life. And then all of a sudden the letter D has vanished from the world and she's the only one that remembers it. And then after that happens, things that start with the letter D start vanishing, like dogs start vanishing, and people will say whole sentences just skipping the letter D from the sentence. And then, the second half of the book, she actually gets pulled into a magical world where she's trying to like get the letter D back. Here's why this book is weird. This book is sold in the adult fantasy section at the bookstore. I think this book reads like a middle grade book. Like the thing I would compare this book to the most is The Phantom Tollbooth. So if you've ever read that, it's a middle grade book that's been around forever. But I would say The Phantom Tollbooth was a lot better. Like if I was going to recommend one of the two, it would absolutely always be The Phantom Tollbooth. The problem is the first half of the book is really interesting and mysterious, and the second half of the book, the actual fantasy world, it kind of falls apart. And there are even parts where like some of the aspects or some of the fantasy elements just are actually kind of annoying. And to be annoyed in the span of a book that isn't even 300 pages is concerning, right? Like I feel like books that are really long, it's easier for them to get to a point where like, oh my God, just move on, right? But this book gets annoying around page 150, and that's pretty fast, right? And it's funny because I had kind of looked at some Goodreads reviews when I picked this up, and they were very mixed. And the first half of the book I was reading, I was like, why were people so hard on this book? And then I got to the second half of the book, and I was like, oh, that's why they were so hard on this book. Because the second half, things just kind of fall apart, and you kind of stop caring about what's happening, and nothing really has a reason why it's happening. It's just kind of like very vague and all over the place, and I just don't know that I would recommend it. Like I said, I loved it at first because it really gave me like Phantom Tollbooth vibes, but I think it's a book that just has an identity crisis. It doesn't know what age it's for. It doesn't know, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I feel like it doesn't quite understand the rules of its own world, which is always a little concerning. So I thought this book was really just okay, unfortunately. Every so often, a book comes along that has a lot of hype, a lot of people love it, and for whatever reason, you might read it and you might say, you know what, this wasn't for me, or I might read it and I might say this wasn't for me. And I have two books this month that I kind of felt that way about. This next one is one of them, but this next one I felt it more than the other one. So we're going to talk about why. So this next book is The Taking of Jake Livingston, which is by Ryan Douglas. First and foremost, let me say that I don't think this is a bad book, and I'm sure there are tons of people who are going to absolutely love this book, and there are already tons of people who do love this book. So if you're interested in this book, I would highly recommend, go to Goodreads or Storygraph and look at some of the really positive reviews and then decide for yourself. But I'm going to tell you why I didn't love it. So I love that it is about a Black gay character. I love the representation in it. I love that it's got like a horror vibe to it. When I read about this book, I was like, absolutely sold. This is absolutely the kind of book that I'm going to love. My problem with this book is there are times where I was reading this book where I felt like this book, it almost feels like the author sat down with a checklist of trigger warnings and tried to put every single one into his book, because there's so many things happening in this book that I would consider trigger warnings, right? Like there's racism, there's homophobia, there's one of the whole things is Jake is dealing with a ghost of this guy who basically was a school shooter, and we actually like see things from his from the school shooter's perspective as well. It kind of tries to humanize him, and that just didn't work really well for me because I was like, I don't really want him humanized. And the other thing is like, I feel like Jake's story, it feels very rushed, and I almost feel like if you had taken out that perspective of this character I didn't really want the perspective of anyway, you could have given Jake a fuller story, which I think would have made for a better book. But literally, like, there was a point where I felt like every page was introducing a new thing where I was like, whoa, that's a lot for a YA book. Whoa, that's a lot. Like, any one of these, like, triggering things could have been the main issue for an entire YA book, but I feel like it had tons of them. Like, you know how sometimes you go and see a movie and it's like rated R for, and like it's the entire, like everything a movie can be rated R for is in the rated R box. You're like, wow, that is a lot of words in one box. I feel like that's what the trigger warnings for this book would look like, because it is everything I can think of that would be a triggering thing is in this book. Which, I mean, like assault on people. I don't know how much I'm allowed to say on YouTube. That's why I'm being a little bit vague, but please, God, check out trigger warnings before you read this book, because it is so many things. And so I say all of that, and the whole reason I mention that is because to me, that was so distracting that I felt like I couldn't really enjoy the book, because it was so like, it almost felt like it was trying to shock me so much that like halfway through the book, I felt exhausted. And again, this is not a long book. So to be halfway through and be like, oh my God, like this is so much, like this is so intense and so many things. And here's the thing, you have all these like really triggering topics, but then you have this almost like lightness of it being like a YA kind of like scary story about a guy who can see ghosts. I don't know. All of these elements did not add up to a whole for me. So like I said, that's just me personally. Check out some other reviews on Goodreads and Storygraph if you want to see some more positive thoughts, because I do think there are people who are going to absolutely like adore this book. And I've even seen some positive reviews where people just loved it. But it just was too much. It was too much for me. Like, I'm not even someone who gets easily triggered by things like that. Usually I can read through those things and it doesn't bother me. But this was just like one after another, after another, after another. And by like I said, by the middle of the book, I was like, oh, I can't. Like, it's too much. So that is my personal review of The Taking of Jake Livingston. All right, so next up, so one of my favorite genres is lit RPGs. So lit RPGs are basically books that read like you're playing a role-playing game, so you actually like see the characters' like stats improve as they level up or like gain skills, or like it's like a very physical thing of like leveling up, gaining skills, gaining stat points, things like that. And one of my favorite series that I've been reading that is a lit RPG that I actually haven't finished yet is Awaken Online. And I'm getting close to the end. I think I'm going to actually try to finish it off finish off the first series, because there's actually like a sequel series or a spin-off series. I'm going to finish the first series, the first 8 books in August. That's my plan. So this is book 4. I know I just said 8 books. This is technically book 6 because there are like little like novellas in between certain books. So this is Awaken Online, book 4, Dominion. I'm not going to tell you too much about what happens in this book because it would be a spoiler, but this series is essentially about this young man who goes into like a virtual reality video game, and the video game like adapts to the player, and it like grows itself and changes itself, and it's run by this really intricate AI system. And through his choices, he kind of like becomes the villain of the story. So I think this is something that people, if you like stuff like Ready Player One, or if you like stuff like Vicious by V.E. Schwab, I think you would really like this. Awaken Online is, I don't think it's not like masterclass writing, but it's very fun writing. You know how sometimes books are just really fun? Like they're not like great literature, but they're just really, really fun. And for me, that's Awaken Online. I really like the characters. I really like the world. I really like the story it's trying to tell. I think it is actually quite a bit better than Ready Player One. And the other thing is, like, if you like stuff like Ready Player One, but you don't like all the references, a lot of people just really don't like all the 80s references in that book. This doesn't have all of that. This is much more like self-contained and tells its own story. It also is telling a story outside of the game as well, of what is happening to like the characters outside of the game, and kind of as this game launches, like the implications it has on the world. And I just really like all of it, and I'm hoping to finish it. So I just ordered the one after this is a short novella, and then the one after that I believe is the last book in the first series. At least I think so. So like I said, I'm going to try and finish it up in August and give you a full review of the series. But I may have to do a full video on that because I think that'd be really fun to talk about it. But I really love this series, and you can get it on Amazon. I think it's actually published through Amazon. But it's It's so fun, and no one. Anytime I talk about it on Book Talk, I feel like no one's ever heard of it before. But it's easily like anytime someone asks me, I get asked all the time, "What's your favorite series? What's your favorite series? Like, what's your favorite book series?" I would say Awaken Online. I love it that much, so I hope you get a chance to read it because and they're chunky books, but they start. The first book is not that big, so you can jump in, and then they progressively get longer as you get further into the series. So Awaken Online. Speaking of lit RPGs, I read the first book of Solo Leveling, which is by Chugong. This is a light novel coming out of Korea. So I've read this is my second light novel I've read, and I think maybe I just haven't got my mind around light novels yet. The thing is, and I don't know what the reasoning is for this. I don't know if it's because of the translation or because of how they're originally written or who they're written for. I don't know, but they always feel the writing does feel very amateurish to me. I don't know if that's the right word, but especially considering that I feel like I read quite a few lit RPGs. This doesn't seem necessarily as great or as deep as those other lit RPGs that I read. But a lot of people love this. And I think part of the reason people love this is I think if this was the first ever lit RPG that you read, you would probably really like it because it would feel so cool and different. But as someone who's read a lot of them, I feel like it's not as different or as new and thoughtful as people think. But I think I'm going to keep reading it because I do still find it interesting. I do still really like lit RPGs. The whole thing with this story is that it's kind of this sort of futuristic world where these gates open and then people have to go into these dungeons and fight monsters, and everyone who has like the magical ability to fight monsters, like they only have a certain level of magic. So like our main character is like the lowest rank, he barely has any magic, and it's not like you can't get stronger. Well, something happens and he actually gets the ability to like get stronger. So he's like the only person that has this ability, which is why he's solo leveling. And so you kind of watch him like as he's leveling up. What I will say is there is also a graphic novel version of this that is coming out. There's 2 volumes out so far. I would maybe recommend that over the light novel, to be totally honest. I've read both now. The first volume of this obviously goes further into the story than the first volume of the graphic novel. But I enjoyed the graphic novel more, and I think it's because you're seeing the visuals of everything, and so you don't have to rely on the just kind of okay writing to describe everything, which I think makes it more palatable. So if I had to recommend one or the other, I would read the graphic novel, the manga. But I don't know. I'm going to read the next book of it. It's like I don't know that I loved it, but I liked it enough that I want to keep reading. So take that as you will. But definitely check it out. But like I said, if you're going to look into lit RPGs, I would also check out Awaken Online. You can look up, there's so many. There's one that's really popular that just is escaping my brain right now. There's also The Wandering Inn is a really good one that you can read completely free online if you want. I think you go to wanderinginn.com. I just feel like there are better ones out there, but if this was the first one I'd ever read, I would think it was pretty cool because it's so different from everything else. So the other thing I might say, the last thing I will say about solo leveling is I think it's a great place to start if you're thinking about getting into lit RPGs. So if you're thinking about trying out a lit RPG, start here, right? Because then you will love this, and then you can like start to read other things afterwards and just expand that horizon of loving this this genre. Because I do think this would be an excellent starting place for lit RPG love. Next up is a book that I was so excited for that I immediately started reading it when I bought it, and I didn't think it was bad, but it didn't quite live up to the hype that I had for it. So this was She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. This has been described as Mulan meets the Song of Achilles. I strongly agree with that. It's kind of like a queer retelling of like a Mulan type story. There was a lot that I liked about this book. I really liked the historical fiction elements. I liked the characters quite a bit. I thought the story was really interesting. I think my big thing with this is I just felt like at times it felt very slow. Like the pace of the story felt like very slow for me. And I wish the pace had been a little bit faster. I don't know. I think, maybe it was the writing style or something, but it just felt a little on the slow side for me. And I remember getting to the end of this book. I finished this a couple days ago. I got to the end and I was like, I was like glad that I got through it. It felt the last, especially like couple hundred pages, kind of felt like a chore to get through a little bit. So take that as you will. But I think a lot of people are really going to love this book. And I'll tell you this, when I finished this book, I turned to my husband and the first thing I said is, this is a book. I never reread books. It's so rare that I reread books, but I said to him, I was like, this is a book that I think I'm going to wait 6 months and reread, because I feel, when you read something, you just feel like your heart isn't in it, or your mind isn't in it, or you're just having a really hard time connecting to it. That's how I felt about She Who Became the Sun. So this is a book I definitely want to give a second chance, because I feel like I should love it. Everything, all the elements are there. It's so many things that I like put into one book. I feel like I should love it, and yet I finished it and I didn't feel like I loved it. So I'm going to give this book a second chance, but I'm curious to know what you all thought about this book, because I still feel a little on the fence. I need to reread it. I need to reread it. I know I never say that, but I need to reread it. What did you guys think of this one? Let me know. And last but not least, I read Darius the Great Is Not Okay by Adib, Khorram. This is very good, very fast read. It deals a lot with Iranian culture. I really like that the main character's struggle is that he just doesn't feel good enough. He doesn't feel confident enough. He is dealing with depression. He is dealing with a family, like his Iranian family. They don't take depression seriously. So they're like, just feel better. Stop taking, why are you taking pills for your depression? Like, why are you doing that? Like, what, can't you just figure it out for yourself? I don't know. I just really like this book a lot. I think it's going to speak to a lot of people. It speaks to belonging, like really like what it means to belong, what it means to feel like you're worthy of love and appreciation and friendship and kindness. And I really liked it. So many people have told me to read it. Like I said, it was a very fast read. It was in no way what I was expecting it to be. Which I don't know what I was expecting, but when I started reading, I was like, oh, this is not what I thought it was going to be. But I really like it. It's lovely, and I think it's a great story, especially for young men who are dealing with families where they just, they don't feel manly enough, or they don't feel positive enough, or they don't feel, like they are worthy of their family's affection. He constantly talks about how he feels like his sister is replacing him for the love of his father, and it's heartbreaking, but it's also really, really relatable. And so I really liked this book. And I know a lot of people have already read this, so let me know what you guys thought about this book in the comments. And that is everything that I read in July. Thank you so much for joining me on this. I would love to know if you've read any of these and what you thought of them, or if you read anything really good in July, let me know in the comments. As always, please make sure to like and subscribe. I hope you have a wonderful August coming up. I hope you had a wonderful July. And as always, happy reading.